it is not often that I find myself in a position where I can help John Redwood understand something which he said he couldn't understand in his speech. I think, John, you said that when it came to talking to these people in big business, you couldn't quite get it as to why they took this perverse view. I shall tell you. It's a sort of confession on my part. Because I want to tell you why, back in the 1960s and 70s, I believed that our national destiny lay in the European Economic Community. And now, 50 years later, I take the absolutely contrary view. Well, back in 1953, as my kids used to say, when the dinosaurs roamed the plains, I became a civil airline pilot and navigator. I was better paid than most of my British contemporaries. I spent half of my life overseas. I met and socialised with my fellow aircrew in the same bars and hotels and restaurants. And in those days, we were almost all chaps working for Western public sector or protected private sector airlines, monopolistic companies. We all spoke English because English is the language of aviation. We were mostly NATO trained. We'd mostly flown similar military aircraft and then similar civil aircraft, and we flew them along the same routes. All our professional problems required multinational agreement for their resolution. We were just like those multinational business people or diplomats. We were only half connected to our own countries. And it was perfectly natural that I and most of my colleagues, I think, formed the same view about the economic and political problems, which were intense at that time, facing the United Kingdom. In defence of my wrong thinking, I should say that that was in the days of the European of the Six, rather than the Europe of today. France, Germany, Luxembourg, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Italy. Well, that was that. But then in a fit of despair at the muddle-headed lack of vision of the Macmillan era Conservative Party, I resolved in the mid-60s to do something to help steer my country and my party onto a better course. And in 1970, somewhat to my own surprise, I turned over a Labour majority of over 7,000 and was returned as the member for Epping. Of course, I'd backed Heath's successful negotiations to enter the European Community. And after his fall, I backed the Wilson referendum. But then something changed. The Thatcher Revolution. And I was part of the hard-nosed bunch working with Airy Neave of blessed memory to bring Thatcher, first of all, to the leadership of the party and then into Downing Street. I became a minister, dealing first with civil aviation and shipping issues, later employment and industrial affairs. I spent a great deal of time in Brussels at the Council of Ministers. I enjoyed that work. I learned a lot, not least about my colleagues, and indeed from my colleagues. Some became good friends, but gradually, imperceptibly, I found myself forced to conclude that that great man, Ernie Bevin, Foreign Secretary in the first post-war Labour government, had been right when he said of the United Kingdom that it is different in character from other European nations and fundamentally incapable of wholehearted integration with them. Of course, by 1979, we had become the Europe of the Nine, and shortly after, Greece joined in 81 the 10. It wasn't just that sort of schoolboy definition of the difference between English law and continental Roman law was right. That is, that our law sets out what you may not do. Continental law sets out what you may do, and everything else is prohibited. That would have been bad enough, but I found that most, not quite all, of my colleagues, and especially the aristocracy of the Commission, took the view, the sort of Bonapartist view, that the Hohenzollern view, that whilst you, the citizens, must obey the law, government, above all, the supranational government, does not have to obey the law. I found that was unacceptable. And gradually I was forced to the conclusion either that we, the United Kingdom, would have to give up what we'd built up over more than 1,000 years from our Scandinavian inheritance of the Folkmoot, for example, to the priceless Magna Carta of 1215, Habeas Corpus Act of 1679, the Bill of Rights of 1689, the Parliamentary Reform Acts of the 19th century. We would have to give all of that and embrace the continental system, or we would have to disengage from the European Union. Of course, the argument could be made, and the remainders do make it, that that's all romantic, old-fashioned stuff, and worth far less than open access to the continental market, and the one seat and the one voice that we have at the table of the 28 in Brussels. From there, of course, just recently, Herr Juncker, who we did not elect and cannot dismiss, warned us of the punishment meted out to deserters from the EU, and that we should be careful, as Mr. Cameron's deal in his renegotiation is not yet done. There could be, he said, legal challenges. There will be votes to be won or lost in the Parliament, in Europe, and amongst the Commission. I say it's time we got off our knees. Our record of successful self-government, of democracy and the rule of law is far superior to that of any other member of the European Union. Time and time again, it has been left to us on this island to rescue Europe from its own follies. Elizabeth I had to rescue them from Philip of Spain, the 17th century, from Bonaparte then in the 19th century, then from the Kaiser and Hitler in the 20th century. They have never had to rescue us from dictatorship and incompetent rule. The EU was a brave attempt for Europe to save it from itself. It might well have worked with a Europe of 6 or 8 outward-looking states, something on the lines of the old Hanseatic League, of those who looked out to the Atlantic rather than down into the Mediterranean. But the divergence of economies, of cultures and standards amongst the 28 is too great to overcome successfully. And the Prime Minister's Project Fear, with its dodgy dossier, concocted by one faction of the cabinet in secret from those who took a different view, but was financed by all of us, is full of wild predictions of the world after Brexit. Just one thing I will say about dismissing that extraordinary prediction. Just forget that it's pretty dodgy stuff to forecast the economy that far ahead. But if you do, if you confuse people by talking about the GDP as though it were the domestic product, don't go too far on that. Because then they had to produce a figure of the loss of a family income of £4,300 a year. How did they get that figure? They divided the gross figure of the loss by the number of domestic households, but not the number in 2030. They divided by the number in 2015, because that made it a bigger figure. And when you get to that degree of deception, of self-deception, you know that the whole thing is rubbish. What of the unknown, however? The unknown, remember, the leap in the dark. There's a leap in the dark if we stay in the European Union, for we do not know how that will develop, and we cannot control it. We know that the day after the referendum, the EU will publish its proposals for the development of a European army. But of course, if you have a European currency, if you have a European foreign minister, well, then you must have the rest of the impedimenta. What's a foreign secretary? What's his value? Unless he's got a Minister of Defence alongside him. What's the value of a Minister of Defence unless he's got an army at his command? So, and where would we be? Where would that leave the UK if we stayed? In the European Union, but out of the euro, half in and half out, like a cat caught in a cat flap, half in the kitchen and half in the garden. It's not an attractive proposition. Of course, we wish the EU well. Of course, we would cooperate where it was in our mutual interest. Of course, we would continue to trade. We still want to buy French cheese and German cars, just as they want to drink Scotch whisky and drive British cars. It would be mad for us to refuse to supply Airbus industry in Toulouse with the wings and the engines and the landing gear of their Airbus. They wouldn't sell very many without those components. In accountancy terms, we'd be better off as we pay 10 billion or so more than we get out. So there would be no need to axe any useful programs presently funded with our money going through Brussels and coming back here. Not on agriculture, nor research, nothing. We could afford to spend a bit more. We could bring our fishing grounds back under our control. More jobs, cheaper fish on the slab. And tomorrow, I understand, a little fleet of trawlers will come up the Thames and moor outside the Palace of Westminster to make the point. We would decide who would come here to live and work. If Mr. Cameron were to stay on in office after Brexit, he would even have the means at his hands to keep his promise to bring immigration down to less than 100,000 a year. Freedom beckons. Freedom to elect and sack those who govern us, who make our laws and decide our taxes. Will we take it? Or will we be a generation who've never shed blood yet to keep that freedom and have no respect for those who did.